Okay, morning everyone. So let me just start with a quick review what we have learned on Tuesday. Okay, so we are in a chapter to understand aggregate demand and aggregate supply. Okay, so the main goal of this chapter is to help us to understand what determines aggregate price and also at the same time what determines the aggregate economy. So in the sense like GDP, right? So in the previous chapter, so basically the way we approach that question is, so we just take the price as a given, and we only look at demand side. So that's what we learned. That's what we did in previous chapter. Now in this chapter, so we are going to bring demand and supply together, put them in the same framework, and we also want to study what determines the aggregate price level. So that's what we are going to do, right? So far, we have looked at aggregate demand curve and aggregate supply curve. Okay, so now let's review what we learned regarding to aggregate demand. Okay, so there's one slide probably is going to summarize things very well. So which is this slide. Okay, on the top. So this is what we learned in previous chapter. Okay, so this is income and expenditure equilibrium model. Okay, on the top, so that's for any given price level. So we are going to find an equilibrium level of aggregate expenditure. But remember, so there are three ways to look at GDP. So the aggregate expenditure, in some sense, that's already give you the real GDP. So hence on the top, just says, so given the price level, if we focus on demand side, and then so on the top, so this diagram is going to tell us the determination of real GDP. Okay, so remember two things. Number one, price given. Number two, we focus on demand side. Okay, now we are going to relax these two things one by one. Let's say, so what happens if we allow price to adjust, right? But certainly, as we are going to see toward the end of this chapter, so the price is going to come out as an equilibrium outcome. Okay. Now, if price can change, okay, so if price decrease, and then so because of the wealth effect and the interest rate effect we discussed, the aggregate expenditure will shift up. And then so based on the income expenditure equilibrium model, we knew so the shift up of the aggregate expenditure leads to a higher real GDP. Now we bring these two data points in the diagram below. And then so we can see the price level declines, then the aggregate expenditure will increase. Or that is going to translate into lower the price, higher the real GDP. But this is real GDP from demand side or aggregate demand. So that's why we have a downward slope aggregate demand curve. Right? Okay. And we also talk about two important things. Number one, so we differentiate between move along the aggregate demand curve versus shift of the aggregate demand curve. And number two, we talk about the factors can cause the aggregate demand curve to shift, either to the left or to the right. Right? To the right means there's increase. To the left means there's a decrease. Okay? What can cause the shift? Including expectation, or maybe including the government policy. Right? Okay, so now next let's just review what we learned regarding to aggregate supply. So aggregate supply is an upward slope curve. So the aggregate supply says higher the price, higher the quantity supplied, but this is in aggregate. Okay, meaning so we talk about real GDP. But what explains this upward slope aggregate supply? So the answer to that is because of the sticky wage, right? So here, so we differentiate between nominal wage and a real wage. Okay, and nominal wage usually is sticky. So how we understand that it is sticky? It just means if you have a job, okay, usually the salary or the wage your employer agree to pay you usually, so that there's a fixed term, right? So at least usually at least it's fixed for 6 months, okay, or usually probably like a one year. And then so this fixed term in terms of your wage or salary, we call it sticky. And the reason why we call it sticky is because there are two things. Number one, you cannot change in that time period, and typically this is what we say like short term. And then number two, usually, so the price level, aggregate price level may adjust, but your wage cannot adjust. In that sense, we call it sticky. So how this sticky wage can affect aggregate supply, and particularly short run? So the answer lies into the equation on the top, right? Profit per unit equal to price per unit minus production cost per unit. If there's a change in aggregate price, okay, so then the price per unit will change, but the production cost per unit may not adjust, or at least not adjust proportional to price per unit, right? Because usually production cost per unit includes the wage bill and other factors, okay? So like ingredients or rent you need to pay, so on and so forth, right? So the reason why I say the production cost per unit may not adjust or may not proportionally adjust with price per unit is lies into here. Wage is sticky, right? And then so in the short term, if aggregate price increase, now this term is fixed, but remember this is a negative sign, hence that's going to boost up profit per unit in short term because of sticky wage. So the higher profit per unit due to higher aggregate price, that's going to induce the business to expand, either by hiring more or to expand or to produce more, either way, right? So but then so in the aggregate, so if everyone do the same things, that means high aggregate price leads to increased aggregate output, right? So again, so this is in short run. And why short run is important? It's because just imagine you are these poor workers, okay? So you're facing a sticky wage, and now there's inflation cause aggregate price to rise, okay? And in the short term, there isn't much you can do because there's a binding contract, okay? Also because it takes time to find a job. But over time, so either protest or you just walk away, right? So you're going to find an alternative job. So that's going to put some pressures on the business owner. So they must adjust wage to reflect the change in standard of living for the workers. But that's caused by sticky wage, right? And consequently, over time, so the profit per unit will fall, and largely because over time the wage must adjust, and the wage must reflect the change in aggregate price. Otherwise, the business will lose their workers, right? So to summarize, this is a short run phenomenon. Now, in the short run, the aggregate price will have impact on aggregate supply. Okay. So in reality, so the things is going to make the sticky wage issue stronger. Why is that? Because in reality, we have many firms. Okay, so they don't So in some sense, there are some firms, they can adjust their price, right? And if that's the case, that's going to make the slope of the short run aggregate supply curve even more positive. Okay. Right. So similar to aggregate demand, now let's see what can cause the aggregate supply curve to shift. So this includes commodity price. So essentially this is the input for supply, right? What is considered as commodity? Just think about gas, think about copper. Okay, so those are the ingredients for production. Okay? So changes in commodity price can affect aggregate supply. Okay? Nominal wage. Okay? So if the nominal wage increase, that is making hiring more expensive, right? And certainly that's going to reduce the profit margin, and hence the aggregate supply will change. Productivity. Okay? So productivity also is going to affect your profitability through your production process, right? Okay, each of these factors produces profit, and then in the aggregate, so that's going to move the short run aggregate supply, right? So here are two different cases. So on the left hand side, we have a leftover shift. So the way we understand that is, given the price level, the aggregate supply will decline. What can cause this decline? So either there's an increase in commodity price, or there's an increase in nominal wage, or there's a decline in productivity, right? On the other hand, if opposite things happens, and then so we have a rightward shift, or there's an increase in short run aggregate supply. Okay. Okay, so here is just summarized, right? So decrease in commodity price, decrease in nominal wage, or increase in productivity. So all of them will cause a rightward shift or an increase in aggregate supply, because each of those will increase the profitability of business. And then in the aggregate, we are going to see an increase in aggregate supply. Okay. So this is a little bit of word shift, and the opposite things happens, right? Okay. Now let's look at this practice question. The short run aggregate supply curve shifts to the right. Which things happen? But first of all, shift to the right means there's an increase. Right? Let's go one by one. Input cost increase, that's going to decrease aggregate supply, so it's not correct. Tax rise, that's going to decrease your profit, right? So that's going to lead to the aggregate supply decrease, so it's not correct. Interest rate rise, that makes production or makes operation more expensive, because you have to pay more for the capital you rent, right? So this is not correct. So the last one is correct, when productivity rise. Okay. All right, so now I'm going to explain to you aggregate supply curve in the long run. Okay. So long run, so here we are thinking about more than a year or even longer, right? Short run, as we said earlier, so short run is a time period, maybe like a few weeks or few months, right? Actually, so the other way to look at short run versus long run is that the difference is, in the short run, the price is not flexible enough to adjust, or you don't have enough time to allow the price to flexibly adjust itself, particularly the wage. In the long run, what is long run? Long run means so there's enough time for the economy to adjust to digest the change in aggregate price. Okay? And then the business must adjust wage, or there's enough time to adjust wage. Okay? So now, if that's the case, now let's see what determines long run aggregate supply. But first of all, the long run aggregate supply will look like this. So this just means over the long term, the aggregate price won't matter to your aggregate supply. And why is that? One way to look at that is, so over long time, over long run, okay? So there's enough time for the economy to respond to the aggregate price change, all right? And particularly in terms of nominal wage. Okay? If the economy has enough time to respond to change in aggregate price by adjusting nominal wage, and then so the story we talked about regarding to short-run aggregate supply, and particularly we talk about when the price change in the short run, the profitability of a business will adjust, won't exist anymore. Right? Let me write down the earlier equation we've had. So the profit of the business per unit equal to the price of the unit, let's call it revenue, minus the cost. Okay? In the short run, the cost in some sense is fixed. If you think about the wage, if wage that's only cost, but your revenue is going to increase because the price increase. Hence, your profit is going to increase. Right? Now, what happens in the long run? In the long run, so the cost will increase, will adjust. Right? If you don't adjust your wage, and then you are going to lose your workers. Right? So hence, in the long run, so the profitability will return to pre-price change time. Hence, the price won't have impact on your profitability. Hence, the aggregate supply is going to be independent of your aggregate price level. Right? But at this point, you may want to ask questions. Okay, yes, the aggregate supply is independent of aggregate price. But why we are here? So just look at this horizontal line. Why we are here? Why we not here or not in this position? Why we are in this particular point along this horizontal line? Or equivalently, so you may want to ask, what determines the level we are on this horizontal line? All right. So the answer to this question will link to the earlier discussion we have regarding to production. I think about what we discussed in the chapter of economic growth. Okay. So what determines production? Okay. Okay. So it's here. So this is a. Oh, by the way, so here we call it potential output. So let me. Okay. So here, so this level is called potential output. All right. So the question I just raised is, so what determines the level of potential output we can produce? Why we produce 800 billion, not 600, or not 1,100? Sorry, 1 trillion. Right, so why not point A? No, we are in B. What determines our potential? Right. Let's see. Oh, okay. So I guess I probably need to explain to you here. All right. So what determines? Now just remind yourself what we learned in the production function. Y equal to, so remember earlier we talked about that, right? So essentially it's going to be the function, let's call F, function of, So the couple of things matters to production, right? So first we need capital, right? And secondly, we say, oh, we need labor who can operate machines, right? What else we need? We may also need human capital, right? So that's a skill, that's the institution we have. So that's help us to produce better. And lastly, we need technology, right? Think about the machine to help us to manage the cornfield, right? Okay, so those are the factors matters to what we can produce. And then so essentially or similarly, so here, so what it determines why we produce 800 is coming from those four different factors, right? If a country, so over time, so they accumulate more capital, and then so this is going to increase, meaning so the entire curve shift to the right. On the other hand, if an economy is experiencing worse and worse educational achievement among their young generation, so that means the human capital start to decline. We are going to produce less and less, or produce less and less effectively over time. And then so this curve is going to shift to the left. Just give you an idea, right? And lastly, I want to emphasize here the L. Okay, and so when we say potential output, so the L, the level L, is the economy operating in a natural rate of unemployment. Okay, remember, so we talk about the unemployment rate, right? So what is the natural rate? Just because there are always some frictions in the economy, right? So we always have some frictional structural unemployment. So hence here, the level we can produce at the potential is when we have a rate of unemployment that equal to natural rate, and not 0%. Okay. Now, let's look at the actual data so that we have a better understanding regarding to the potential output. Okay, so this is for the US economy from 1990 to 2014, right? So this blue line, this is our actual aggregate output. Okay, and this brown line, this is the potential output. Okay, and then the difference is the gap. And certainly, if the potential is above actual, meaning we are in a recession, right? So look at here, it's 2008 and 2009. On the other hand, so if you produce more than your potential, then you are in the expansion. Think about 2000, right? So before the dot-com bubble burst. All right, and then the other thing I want to emphasize is so the difference between your potential and your actual, so largely explained by the cyclical unemployment. Okay, now let's see so how we are going to move from short run to the long run. Okay, so here, so we have two curves. One is long run aggregate supply, the other is short run aggregate supply. Okay, so for example, the current aggregate price equal to P1. Okay, and then so you will find out what is going to be the real GDP. We are going to use short run because this is what happens in the short run, right? And then you're going to see the output will be Y1. Okay, so Y1 is greater than YP. So YP is your potential. And then what this means? This means we produce more than we potentially can produce. This means the unemployment rate is very low. Right? Why I say that is because we are operating beyond our potential. Then certainly, so we must hire more than we usually potentially you can hire. But remember, even at your potential production, so we still have some unemployment, right? So that's why we can exceed this YP. Right? Okay. Now, if the unemployment rate is very low, so what this means to labor market and how the labor market will respond. Okay, so let's just go step by step. If unemployment rate is low, meaning so there are very few workers available in the labor market, meaning if a business want expand or want to hire, they're going to have a hard time, right? Because there are not enough workers they can find. And then so in order to fill their orders or in order to operate, and then so the business must raise wage. Otherwise they cannot attract workers they need. Now if the wage rate increase, remember when we talk about short-run aggregate supply, so that leads to an increase in cost. That's going to lead to the aggregate supply to reduce, right? So you can see, so the wage increase is going to lead to a decline in short-run aggregate supply, and until we reach here, reach to our potential. Right? So this is what happens in the short run if price level is too high. Okay? And then so you may wondering, so why the price level becomes so high? Okay? And then so we need to wait a little bit until we finish this part. And when we introduce the aggregate demand and aggregate supply equilibrium model, you will see what causes a temporary high price. But here, the key for you to understand is if price is a little bit high, and then the economy is going to adjust itself. And here, the adjustment is coming from here, right? So price is high, and then you produce a lot, meaning so the labor market is very tight, right? So you can't find workers you want. And then you must raise wage. If you raise wage, that's going to reduce the aggregate supply. Okay? And then, so we are going to see a movement from short-run aggregate supply 1 to short-run aggregate supply 2 until we reach here. Okay? On the other hand, okay, it could be the case, so the price is very low. Again, so later I'm going to explain to you what explain why we have a price is too high or too low in the short run. Right? And but here, so the key for you to understand is, so if we find we are in a position like this, how the economy is going to respond itself. Okay, so far we haven't talked about the government yet, but toward the end of this discussion, you're going to see the analysis justify the intervention from the government. Okay, like say for example, currently the U.S. government initiated massive stimulus plan, send pretty much everyone a free check. Right, so you will understand what's behind that. Okay, So, but now we need to step by step. So we are in P1. Similarly, you can find out your actual production is Y1. And clearly, so Y1 is less than YP. All right. So now Y1 less than YP, what this means? It means unemployment is high. Okay. Why I say that is because we produce less than we potentially produce, meaning we must have some of our capacity or in idle. That naturally means so there are vacancies not filled, right? So we have high unemployment. So now this high unemployment, what will be the next? So first of all, this just means there are a lot of people looking for a job, right? Because the business, they don't have enough orders, so they just can't fill all the job. And then there are a lot of people looking for a job, right? So now if there are a lot of people looking for a job, how would that affect wage? Certainly wage will fall, right? Just remind yourself, a video we watched before the break. It's called 99ers, right? So they interviewed a bunch of people who lost their job. And then so during the interview they say so they are willing to take whatever job they have. There was a lady, so she was a professional making 70,000. Now later after lost her job for quite a long time, so she says she's willing to take whatever job she has. She's willing to work for like 30,000 per year, right? So that's just behind this move. Wage is gonna fall. Now if wage is gonna fall, so that's going to make the business more profitable, and hence in the short run the aggregate supply will increase, right? So that means the curve will move to the right hand side. Sorry. And then so we are going to here, right? Okay, so this just tells you how the economy is going to adjust itself, right? But during this adjustment process, okay, so the economy is going to suffer, and this suffering can be significant, okay, like these pictures is going to tell you. So this happens in 1933. This is after during the Great Depression, right? So the worst economic crisis in human history. So in the United States in 1933, the unemployment rate was 25%, and the real GDP dropped by more than 25%, right? And the people line up to get government support, right? Like this background picture shows. And back then, as we started this class, right, back then, so we don't have enough understanding what made it happen, right? And it turns out, so we had government policy making things worse. Now we have come a long way, so now hopefully we have better understanding. So that's what we're going to do for the rest of this class. Okay. Okay, so before I explain to you further in terms of theory, let's look at the actual data to see whether this sticky wage is actually real or not. Okay. So what we have here. So we look at the data from 1997 to 2013. Okay, so this is US economy. So we look at unemployment rate. So it's on the left hand side. So let's look at unemployment rate. So say for example, 1997 was 5%, and then 2009 it hits to 10%. Right. So now on the other hand, so right hand side, we look at percentage of workers receiving the same wage for 1 year. All right. So this is this line. Okay. If the wage can flexibly adjust, and then if there's a high unemployment, okay, so let me just write down. So if unemployment rate is high, okay, now hypothetically thinking, if wage can flexibly adjust, so what that means? That means the wage rate supposed to decline, right? Because there are so many people lost their job, they're willing to take whatever job they have, and then so the business owner so find out so they can squeeze the wage, right? Because they still can find people to fill the job, right? But if we look at the data, we find out so during the peak of the unemployment, okay, so there are more and more people instead of less and less people. So there are more and more people receiving the same wage as they have before. So this is a strong indicator, shows the wage are sticky, right? So wage can't flexibly adjust, right? So that is a support to our assumption, okay? But certainly this sticky wage means a lot for our analysis, because this sticky wage explains why the aggregate supply curve is upward slope, and then so later you're going to see so this upward slope aggregate supply curve help us to explain what made it happen in terms of recession. Okay, right, so let's just take a few minutes break, and then so we are going to look at this aggregate demand and aggregate supply curve.